Invincible! Your father may have fled, but I know you're here. Come and face justice for the lives you've taken. Come and face Powerplex! Yeah, bitch!
Man, this week's episode was an absolute banger because we finally got introduced to Powerplex. We got Rex and Ray ending before they even got things started. We got Rudy helping Amanda with her situation. And this week's post-credit scene sets up an oncoming war. Now look, last week it seemed like a lot of you all were disappointed by episode 5, but I think it's safe to assume that this won't be the case for this week's episode. We've got a lot to discuss in this breakdown and review of Season 3, Episode 6 of Invincible. Spoilers ahead. We open this episode with a flashback as we meet Scott Duvall, who is voiced by the incredible Aaron Paul, as he's here to visit his sister Jessica in Chicago to celebrate his niece Gretchen's 10th birthday. As we get to see them together for one last time, moments before his life is about to change forever. Now we see that he has superpowers that give him the ability to absorb an energy, and as of right now his powers are quite limited, but his niece still loves them. Now it's just a regular day spending time with his family, and he just returns from getting coffee, and as he enters the elevator to return to them, in a blink of an eye, we get the catastrophic events between Omni-Man and Invincible tearing up this city, including his sister and his niece. Now, from his point of view, all he's able to put together is that Invincible was there and seemed to be the one responsible for killing his family, which left him completely broken and devastated and put him on his path of vengeance. Now, I know a lot of people weren't fans of Zack Snyder's BVS, and to each their own. I really enjoy that film, especially his uncut version of that movie, but either way, the opening of that film where Bruce watches Zod versus Superman and he sees his building get destroyed and loses his close friend, this reminded me a lot of that opening scene, as well as seeing the anger that came from that event and how that led Batman to wanting to fight and get his revenge on Superman, and here we have a slightly similar situation. Now flash forward to Scott seeking some type of justice as we see him trying to talk to the district attorney who he's been trying to get a hold of as it pertains to the Invincible case but hasn't been able to get a hold of her. He tells her how important his sister and niece were to him, and he feels like their deaths were in vain because there's been no progress on the investigation for not just his family but for the 1,000 of others who died that day. Now she explains to him that Invincible was the one who saved the planet from an alien threat and should not be prosecuted for that. Now Scott tells her that he feels that a jury should decide that because the alien was Invincible's father and that he should be held accountable. And what makes things even more interesting is we see that Scott works for the GDA, and we know that they work with heroes to stop things like that from happening, like what happened in Chicago, so it adds even more depth to this story. As we see him watching things from that day, such as the train wreck with Invincible, and he doesn't see anything else but the person responsible for his family's death. Now we get to see some quick shots behind the scenes of how the GDA preps for any future threats. As they are watching footage from the previous encounters with Viltrumites, we see them building new weapons and even testing them as well. As this is where Scott takes notice of one of the particular weapons being tested on, as he sees this as a means to help him on his quest for revenge. We see this conversation that Scott's having with some of the other employees, and one of them actually shares a similar viewpoint on how he feels about some of the heroes, particularly Invincible not being held responsible for their actions. Then we have the other employee who feels Invincible is their only chance to withstand any future visits from Viltrumites, at least until Oliver grows up. Now this whole opening scene was just fantastic to me. Like they did this earlier in the season when we got to see the villain's point of view and how they became villains, and I just really love how this episode took the time to give us his backstory and sharing the personal experience that he had. Now not saying that what he's going to do in this episode or where his mindset was in this episode was right, but I understood where his frustration and pain came from all within the span of this incredible 5 to 6 minute opening sequence. Now, speaking of Oliver, we see Elephant terrorizing civilians for eating meat as Oliver punches him onto a car without clearing the area, as we see that this is a part of him training with Invincible and Eve. Now, Oliver takes advice from Eve on how to deal with the Elephant, who quickly realizes that he's basically Oliver's test dummy and he makes easy work of him really quickly. Now, after the training, Oliver and Mark talk about how their father would have him training against lesser villains like Elephant, as the conversation gets a little bit real as he asks him if there's ever going to be a time where people will forgive their father after what he did. Again, I just really appreciate the fact that the story hasn't abandoned showing the aftermath and the consequences to what Nolan did back in season 1, and how it still and will most likely continue to affect both Mark, Debbie, Oliver, which by the way, he truly hasn't gotten a chance of spending time with his family together, including with his father, Nolan. Which to that point, Oliver brings up and explains because of his Thraxan genes that he has a very incredible memory and he remembers everything from him being a baby. He remembers the love that his mother had for Nolan and brings up that there must have been something inside of Nolan for his mother to love him so much like she did. As Mark goes into the two sides of Nolan, one being the loving father that they knew, but the other side of him being the Viltrumite who was abiding by his duties. As Oliver questions which was the real dad. Now we catch up with Scott, who's suited up and practicing what he's going to say to Invincible in front of his wife, whose name is Becky. He believes he's finally ready as he has been preparing for this moment and has been mapping out various Invincible sightings over the months. Now we see that Scott has stolen what is called the biotherm disc from the GDA lab, and they will allow him to level up and hurt Invincible. Now these experimental biotherm discs help him absorb kinetic energy, as Becky puts the disc in him and hit him with a hammer to show how the absorption energy actually works. Now we see that he has a baby boy by the name of Jack, and you really get a sense and understanding that his plans aren't rooted in generic villainous tendencies, but instead he sees this as getting revenge for the people he loved who were killed by a person who hasn't been held to any kind of punishment. Now from one family to another, we cut to family time with the Graysons, with Eve and new boyfriend Paul in attendance. Now everyone seems to be enjoying each other's company, everything's going well as we see Paul continues to try to fit in with the super family as he shares a story about his experience as a realtor when following up a story from Mark and Eve about defending the prison from supervillains. Now we see Paul is embarrassed by using his real life story and comparing it to Eve and Mark and being superheroes, and he's embarrassed by the whole situation. But we see him talking to Debbie and he's struggling to fit in with the family still, but Debbie tells him,
"It's not about measuring up, it's about showing up. And as long as you're here, that's what matters."
Now back with Scott, who's now embracing the Powerplex name as he's prepared to get Invincible's attention by throwing himself off of a building to kickstart his absorption powers. Now while that's going on, we see William celebrating his birthday at the bowling alley as Mark sees that Amber was invited and she gives him a big hug. Now she introduces him to Kyle, who happens to be a Seance Dog fan, and him and Mark bond over this. Now Mark and Amber catch up for the first time since their breakup, and things are going well. There's no animosity or hate towards one another. They've both moved on at this point, but unfortunately this good conversation is cut short because they notice that Powerplex is on the news, who's wrecking havoc downtown, but Mark turns off the TV and just wants to spend time with his friends. Now back to Powerplex, he explains to the officers why he's doing what he's doing, and I love the intercut of the Invincible title card drop every time he said his name. But in comes Shapesmith, who's here to save the day by himself without the help of the Guardians, as he pisses Powerplex off even more by shifting into Invincible. Now Shapesmith never stood a chance versus Powerplex as he underestimates him and learns the hard way as he's punching him until he is powered up as Powerplex unleashes the energy from the hits and levels Smith, knocking him out cold. Now back at home with Scott, he returns and he is convinced that the GDA knows he stole the disc and it's just a matter of time until they find him, and he just can't understand why Invincible didn't show up. Now the memorial service for remembering those who lost their lives in Chicago is happening in a few days, and Scott forgot about this and he gets upset about that as we see him charging up and he scares his son in doing so, setting up some future foreshadowing for later in this episode as his wife reminds him that the chances of Invincible attending are pretty high. Now we see the Grayson family preparing for the memorial service as well, as Mark is concerned about showing up, but Eve reminds him that he's not going as Invincible, but he's going as Mark. I got a kick out of seeing this scene here as Paul is going to the memorial with them. He's worried they're going to be running late, but they show Paul how they travel with the help of Mark. Now taking a break from the main story, we cut to Rudy, who is building a surprise for Amanda.
It's an advanced genomic engine, actually. Miniaturized, hardened, and built around a fusion battery core. It has to be close to you to work, so it had to be either a hat, a sash, or belt.
Now this belt basically fools her curse and grants her with the ability to not lose time by turning her younger every time she transforms, as we see it actually works and she is just beyond thankful. Meanwhile, we see Ray tells Rex that she's going to be quitting being a superhero. She explains to him why she wants Rex to join her in quitting and being superheroes and consistently risking their lives and missing out on the life that they deserve. Now, unfortunately, Rex only knows one thing of being a hero since birth and tells her that he's not going to be leaving with her, but she is still going to be leaving as we see them kiss. Now, I mentioned this before that I have enjoyed seeing the story and the relationship develop between Rex and Ray versus what we got last season with Amanda and Rudy, so I wasn't necessarily happy to see her leaving. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to Ray and if there's going to be some type of event, aka a war that's coming that might bring her back out of retirement, or it's going to be interesting to see if Rex eventually joins her. Now, as the memorial service begins, we see that Powerplex arrives and he reads off the victim's name as Mark, Eve, Oliver, Debbie, and Paul step away to safety. Now, Eve steps in and wants to stop him and wants Mark to not be involved and to provoke him even more. Now, Eve quickly understands his power skill and tries to avoid hitting him and uses her powers to create these force field shields to do so. Now, as Eve is able to contain him, in comes the Guardians, Immortal, Shapeshift, and Darkwing as Eve lets them handle taking Powerplex into custody. Now, personally, I did wish the fight would have lasted a little bit longer between Eve and Powerplex, and also I would have liked to saw the Guardians in action too, but I know that Powerplex isn't here to fight anyone else other than Mark, but I just selfishly want to get a little bit more action in that scene. Now, in custody, we see Scott in the back of the truck, and as they're driving to the GDA to the Pentagon, truck hits a bump on the road, and Scott is able to put two and two together and starts banging himself against the wall, and he collects the energy from that and he makes his escape. Now, back at the memorial service, we see Mark and Eve share a moment of acknowledging those who were lost and how they've been sheltered from this side of being a superhero by Cecil. Now, Scott has returned home, and at this point, he's ready to throw in a towel, but Becky has an idea, one that they will come to regret a little bit later. Meanwhile, Donald shares Scott's file with Invincible without Cecil's knowledge. Invincible wants to meet Scott in person and talk to him, but he learns that he escaped, and he sees the message that Scott and his wife Becky have set up. Now, Invincible arrives and tries to apologize and mentions Jessica and Gretchen, and it seemed like it was working for a little bit, but unfortunately Scott's rage comes back and he remembers what he's here for, to fight and kill Invincible, as Powerplex uses his powers against Invincible, who's trying to avoid fighting back, but he sees that Scott's gonna hurt who he believes are civilians in danger as we see Invincible kicks him. Now, Invincible tries freeing Jack and Becky, but she spits in his face, which throws off Invincible, which gives the opportunity for Powerplex to grab Invincible by the head, and he unleashes a huge power surge. But unfortunately, in doing this, he notices ashes from behind him, and he realizes that he killed both his wife and his son. I'm not gonna lie, I thought this moment was incredibly effective and very emotional as we see Powerplex sees what he did and he cries, but he stops crying. He focuses all his energy and his anger towards Invincible. Invincible pushes through the energy and grabs his hands, and instead of hurting him and fighting back and physically maybe even killing him, he embraces Scott by hugging him, which causes another surge, but Scott's drained all of his energy at this point and leads to him tapping out, and we see that Invincible has stopped him. Now, in the custody of the GDA in a cell, we find out that Scott's disc cannot be removed from his body, but he's going to be under a rehabilitation program like Sinclair and Darkwing were, and he could be maybe used as a hero later on. Now, Invincible wants a moment alone with Scott, and he tells him,
I remember them. Jessica and Gretchen. I didn't know their names before, but I remember them. I think that was a mistake now. I hope that's a comfort to you.
Now, Scott doesn't accept his apology and tells Invincible that he's going to break out eventually, and when he does, he's going to get his revenge. As we end this episode with seeing Eve coming to pay a visit to Mark, and she comforts him, but off in the distance, we see another drone is watching from afar. Which brings us into this week's incredible post-credit scene where we officially see Angstrom with the scar across his face that was left from Mark from their last encounter, as he has gathered other Invincibles from across the multiverse to get his revenge and to start up the Invincible War. To me, this episode was just straight up amazing. I honestly think this episode was just incredible. I do wish that we could have spent more time with Becky and also obviously more scenes with Powerplex, but I can't stop thinking about the time that we did spend on showing his pain and how he felt about losing his sister and his niece, and just the theme of once you allow anger to control you, it can lead you to more pain and suffering. I am loving the continuation of seeing Mark this season and what it means to be a hero, and that includes the fact that unfortunately people will still see him as a villain when he can't save everyone's life, and they blame him for that. Now, my only issue with this episode, besides again wanting to spend more time with Becky and Scott and the Duvel family, but the subplots this week weren't the strongest for me, but I still like how they're a part of the overall story, right? How we get to see the downside of what it means to be a hero, from Ray quitting, or how Amanda's life so far has been this experience of whenever she uses her powers, she is literally taking so much from her in doing so. The Paul and Debbie stuff I really don't care that much for, but I definitely think it's setting up this whole thing that Paul's going to probably die by the end of this season, or at the very least he's going to be hurt very badly. And of course the stuff that's going on with Oliver missing his dad, I'm really enjoying that stuff, and the whole idea of the redemption arc for Nolan and how he wants people to eventually forgive his father. Again, shout out to Aaron Paul, who I'm a big fan of. He did a phenomenal job in voicing Scott and brought that Jesse Pinkman type of sympathy and understanding and humanity to the character, who I'm very much looking forward to seeing again in the future. Which, speaking of the future, that post-credit scene sets on the oncoming war of Invincible, and I cannot wait. Now, that's going to be the end of my recap and breakdown of episode 6 of season 3 of Invincible, an episode that showed us that heroes can't save everybody, or how their actions can impact others and create enemies, was just so great. If you want to check out my reactions to the biggest highlights of this episode, they're going to be available to watch on the channel now under my Invincible playlist. Now, my favorite part of covering this every single week is reading you all's awesome comments, so please share them in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts about Aaron Paul as Powerplex, as well as what you think about the side stories this week, and of course, what do you think is going to happen next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, I would love it if you all can help get this video to over 500 likes by hitting the like button, of course, if you enjoyed the breakdown, and also hit the share button. If you love this show, love talking about the show, share this video with all of your friends who love talking about it just as much as we do. And if this is your first time here, consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel, as well as if you want to show even more support, consider joining the channel memberships. You all are awesome, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.